I realized as I was preparing to talk today that I wanted to show pictures that would convey what it was that I was describing, and I realized I don't think I have a single picture that I know of that has me and Louis or the people around me during that period which was so formative in my life, and I think it follows through a very strong tradition in my family of never remembering to bring the camera, and if you bring the camera, not remembering to take it out of the car, and you bring it out of the car, not remembering to take a picture. So I imagine that this is just a familial trait. But there are other people around here who were really good with cameras, so I imagine that some photos will show up at some point. But instead, I realized I did have lots of really strong mental images of that period, and I wanted to just say a few words to mostly focus not on the discovery of dark energy per se as what it was that I discovered coming to the group that I came to at this was in 1982, 83. And what I think I'm really describing is, a number of us here today. I've been doing quick reunions with a bunch of other friends who were young grad students around that same period. And I think for all of us coming in, there was a feeling that we were all sort of coming into a world that had a very defined culture and set of traditions, and I think we were learning as much from that culture and set of traditions about how to be scientists as we were by any courses we were taking or even maybe experiments we were working on at that given moment. And so in some sense this was Louis's world, and I think part of it is because I think he was helping define what this culture was, but also he built up a group of people around him, and he found himself in a group that I think also defined this culture together. And so I was going to describe just a few of what at least I picked up showing up at that time. I think, and I should comment that when I first arrived, I came to work in Rich Muller's group. And that gave me the advantage of the fact that Louis was always hanging around Rich Muller's group. So he would, be in and out of the office all the time, and so you would get to know him just because you were in the next desk over in the next room, and so a lot of what I learned, a lot of what the ways I met Louis had to do with Rich, but also a lot of what I understood about Louis I think came because Rich would also often use Louis as his exemplar when he would describe things that he had learned about how to be a scientist, or a certain scientist of this particular type that we were all being inducted into at the time. And so I was going to describe a few of the things that I remember Rich discussing, which I think which are in some sense categorized or captured a number of the different other memories that I'll then talk about. So some of them I think fell in the category of the can-do, sort of cowboy spirit of, you as a physicist, you had the hunting license to look at any problem whatsoever, and that you also had the arrogance to believe that you were going to be able to solve that problem, or at least be able to make a measurement that might be relevant to the problem, and that if there was equipment that you had around, you would use it. If there was not equipment that you had around, you would invent equipment, and you had the wealth of talent around you of the engineers, the mechanical, electrical, who knew how to put these things together and how to make these things work, and Louis was obviously as I'm sure you've been hearing today, the master at just creating things that would allow you then to make a measurement or make a discovery. So I think there was that strong sense of can-do optimism, but in my mind there was also there was this very clear culture of rigorous skepticism that nothing was left on the table that could be questioned and without a good round questioning. And it was very hard for any seminar speaker to get through a talk without everybody in the room constantly jumping on any point that they thought might deserve a tough going over. And I think that it's an interesting, because I think, as I was just saying to somebody a little bit earlier today, I think that culture drifted a little bit during the years as we were grad students and then into our young postdoc ships, to the point that now you go to a physics colloquium, and it's really rare that you hear a rough question of the speaker, and I think people are just much more gentle and polite, in that setting, and I think it makes it much easier to go and give a colloquium nowadays. On the other hand, it wasn't mean-spirited. It was it was a culture. It really meant that people got much tougher questions, and I think the audience learned more because of that, in that style, in that world that existed during that period. So let me give some examples of both the can-do and the rigorous skepticism. I remember, first in the can-do spirit, it was definitely the case that everybody watched the physics news and made phone calls to find the physics news, pretty religiously. Papers came out, and there weren't too many papers. People actually read papers. And they would then discuss them and then try to figure out, is there something else we could do that would either disprove the point here or make a measurement that now this might make possible. And that was sort of the day-to-day life. I think I had a lot more of that constant asking, is there something we can do with what we just read in the latest edition of PhysRev Lead or AppJ or something that just showed up. There was, I remember Rich making a big point to me at one point, that he had been struck by the fact that Louis had big holes in his area, in his expertise. There were whole areas of things that you would have expected that he would know, but he didn't. That wasn't what he thought was important. What was important was that when he needed those things, he would know them. He would learn them when he needed them, and that the part of this tradition was this tradition of just learning what you wanted when you wanted it, and that you didn't need to know everything, beforehand. And I remember Rich, making that point to me. On the and these in some sense are I think on the can-do side. On that rigorous skeptic side, I remember a good example was this idea which Stuart referred to, where Louis loved the what I nowadays you might think of as the party game of two lies and a truth. Where everybody in the room tells two lies about themselves and one truth, and everybody else has to guess, which one's the truth and which one's lies. But of course, this was used as the technique for blind analysis before people were doing what they called blind analysis. And the classic example was somebody would come in with a plot and want to figure out whether or not a peak in the plot or some feature in the plot was just a statistical fluctuation, or whether they'd really captured something important. And so what they would do is they would make, maybe a dozen of these plots that are designed to look very, very similar, but where the only difference is that you've scattered them statistically in different ways, and then you hand it around to your toughest-minded friends, and typically, Louis would ask Rich, or Rich would ask Louis, and others in the environment would all be pulled in and said, okay, now go through this list of 12. Tell me on which of these do you see the most striking features. I'm not going to tell you what the features you're looking for necessarily, and then they would you would then decide whether or not there was some validity to that feature as being a something of interest if it popped to the top of everybody's list, as opposed to just being there amidst all the statistical fluctuations in the noise of the other graphs. So I think I imagine you might be hearing an example of this in the following talk from Walter, because I remember doing this on the issue of whether the craters on the Earth were periodic and lined up with the extinctions on the Earth, and we had a whole series of plots that were generated to look similar in that way. All right, so those are some examples of this. Others I was going to bring up, we're starting to have to do with the kinds of topics that were being studied. And when I joined Rich's group, I think Rich's, the range of things that were going on in that group by itself already was a clear example of the next generation of Louis' style, where when I joined that group, there was a tabletop cyclotron experiment to do mass spectrometry. There was a Raman scattering experiment where you collect samples from high-flying aircraft of atmosphere above the ocean and use Raman scattering to study the atmospheric constituents at the time. There was, let's see what else. I was pulled in for the possible idea of doing a reproduction of the deflection of starlight by the sun that you do in eclipse to demonstrate Einstein's theory of general relativity. But Rich was proposing trying to do it with Jupiter at the time when I joined the group. We actually never did that experiment, although that was the thing that got me up the hill the very first time. Let's see what else was in play. I was going to mention. Oh, and of course, they had just finished doing the rubber mirror, which was the first adaptive optics example that I knew of that actually worked. There was and clearly there was the supernova project, which I'll come back to in a minute. And you've heard about this from Carl, and. Not to mention, there was still some leftover connections with George's group. People were going back and forth and there was still some CMB discussion going on in the weekly meetings, and so it was this amazing range of science, and clearly this was just seen as how you go about doing science, and I think that obviously was a Louis legacy, that this is what it means to be a scientist, and I always feel inadequate in looking around my research group to see how monoclonal the topics have become, and I see very few groups that are now doing that sort of wide-ranging science today, and which I thought has such an important place and can be such a strong way of doing science. A example that was also never pursued, but also shows Louis' style. Was I remember that after he got to know me a little bit, over a few years as my being a grad student, I remember one time he came into my office and he handed me a little sheaf of pages and said, I've been meaning to get back to this sometime, but I haven't had a chance. Perhaps you'd like to work on this with me at some point. And it was he was beginning to start doing a little bit of study of the images of Mars, and which of course had been looked at as possible evidence for intelligent life, because there were lines that people were reading as canals on Mars. But of course, he was that wasn't what he was interested in. He thought there were other things you could make out of these images at that time, and so he brought them in and put them on my desk, and since I happened to be very deeply engaged in trying to finish my thesis at that time, I don't think I really followed up as much as I should, and unfortunately, I think Louis had died before I really pulled out the pages again and would have been ready to work on it. But once more, I'm still imagining that he must have had entire drawers full of ideas that he just meant to get back to someday as soon as he found somebody who might be free to work with. And obviously, once more, science as a social activity was clearly still in evidence, in this kind of interaction. All right, so those are some of the can-do sides. Some of the more rigorous sides came through in the fact that I think most people would not have described Louis as an easy character at that time, and I actually saw him. I got to know him, I think, at a period when he was actually getting more mellow, at that stage. But I remember very clearly a few examples of why it was that most people, I think, had a healthy bit of fear, when they would enter a discussion with Louis, which came up, for example, at the Monday night seminar series. Have you guys already spoken about that today? So every Monday night, and you would go up to Southampton Street, up just above Hinkle Park, in North Berkeley, and you would everybody bring the chairs out and spread out an array of what we would usually put up like 30 chairs in rows on one side of the room, and to watch the speaker, and on the other side of the room was Louis. In his chair, in his big chair. We were on the folding chairs, and on his side of the room, in the big chair, he would be peppering the speaker with questions which couldn't be ignored, and everybody else was still giving tough questions at the time, but they were but they were a little bit different when they came from Louis, and I still remember very clearly a number of times where the speaker was having a very difficult time. One time in particular, I remember, I think the speaker hadn't gotten more than like the second slide up, and Louis, started asking, but where those error bars come from? And the speaker was not able to give a sufficiently good explanation for where the error bars came from on that plot, and Louis wouldn't let the talk go on. It just wasn't worth hearing the talk if he couldn't manage to explain the error. And the rest of the people in the room were saying, "Come on, Louis, we want to hear the talk. Can we go on?" But I don't think he got to tell it. I don't know if everybody else remembers. I don't think he got to tell the talk that night. And so this was the setup for the fact that the first 5 minutes before those Monday night Louis Alvarez seminars, and they, very distinguished speakers would come through and get grilled potentially. But for the first 5 minutes, it was the news, and the news was presented by us grad students, and we would be expected to have spent a good part of the at least the latter half of the previous week, calling around the world. We didn't have the internet in that period to provide us with the rumors, and there was no and you basically would get on the phone, you would look at some papers. Sometimes you would use Aviation Week as a possible starting point, and then you go around and you'd ask the other faculty, has anybody heard anything of interest lately that might make good news story, and then you were expected to go into some depth of understanding, and I'm looking around the room at the other grad students who did this with me, and so when it was your turn, you were expected to know enough about this rumor of a new resonance that had been seen, a new some new development in some part of physics, but you were supposed to know enough about it that you could explain what the graph was that you were going to show, and that you could explain where those error bars came from, and people had a hard time. I mean, a number of times Louis would be just as rough on this poor, second-year grad student as he was going to be on the visiting distinguished guest who was giving a talk. And so people were very worried about these 5 minutes of talk that when your turn came around every couple of months for these Monday seminars. So in those senses, I remember that Louis was just not seen as an easy person, during that period. Now, on the other hand, I think that he also, interestingly enough, along with that sort of curmudgeonly side, he had actually a very strong fatherly mentoring side. And I think if you happen to come in, sneak in under the radar, and get into that mode with Louis, you had another very different experience. And the example that I remember most vividly was the day that he came to my office when I had just finished collecting the last data I needed to write for my PhD thesis, which, by the way, was on the Nemesis star that may be may yet still be causing periodic extinctions on Earth that Rich had proposed with a few colleagues. So I just gotten that data, and Louis came to my office and said, that's a really good moment to mark. Let me take you out to celebrate, and can I take you to my club in the city that night? And I said, of course, I'm sure. And so I got dressed for the evening, and he took me into San Francisco, where we were going to the Bohemian Club. Which I only knew about at that time, mostly from the fact that that was the period in which the newspapers were full of all the upset about whether people were somehow cutting women out from the professional life of San Francisco, and so I only knew about from that side of those stories in the late, I guess late 70s, early 80s, but he was taking me there to show me one of the things that he really enjoyed doing, and to have me meet his friends there at the Bohemian Club. And and I remember him taking me around. There were various people to talk to, and in particular, I still remember that there was one person who lived upstairs in a back room that apparently he actually lived at the club, who was a violinist, and he happened to have a Stradivarius violin. And I remember, this is one of these completely irrelevant memories, but I remember that since I played violin, it was a one of those moments where the day that I finished my PhD thesis data, I got to actually play a Stradivarius violin for a few minutes, and that was under the wing of Louis as in his fatherly mode, which I just felt very lucky to have had that chance to experience at that stage early on in my life, my career. And of course, I think, let me remind myself of where I was going next. And of course, in the end, many of these elements all came together in the fact that I got to do the work that I was doing in a few ways. I mean, I think the creative looking around for ideas anywhere and can-do spirit, I think, is what brought Louis back to talk to Rich about that he'd just seen that the military was using these robotic telescopes to look for satellites, spy satellites, and it occurred to him that actually was time to revisit the Sterling Colgate's old idea of, or one that he was still working on, of trying to do robotic telescope work, and I think you heard about that today. And so that kicked off the work that I ended up, obviously having made much, it's basically been my career ever since, but beginning with that moment. And then the fact that there was, and then the fact that I think Louis had taught Rich so much about how to think about, rigor and yet can do, meant that I was able to do projects which I don't think I would have known how to approach without those things in the background. And then there was also the personal aspect, this fatherly aspect, I think, and mentoring aspect was important because when Carl and I first started talking about the idea of going out to the much more distant search for supernova in order to make a measurement of what we thought was going to be the deceleration of the universe. At the time, I think Carl was very convincing to me as the ultimate optimist that we were ready to do it and we could do it. And I, in my more student-based skeptic mode, was still convincible because I felt that the software was up to it, and so we were both convinced by that stage. Rich was still more skeptical, and he wasn't sure that it was the right moment to do it. But he said that one of the things he had learned from Louis was the sense that you have to support these ideas when they come up, and that was part of his job as the group leader, was to make sure that we moved ahead and we tried these things, even if he wasn't sure that was the right thing to do. And so I think that mentoring style also was what meant that we ended up, Carl and I, starting an experiment that we, weren't sure was, we thought we could get to work, but I don't know whether anybody else thought it was going to work. And of course, it didn't work for the first 3-4 years, which was about how long the whole project was going to be originally. And but we were very glad that we ended up having the opportunity to do that, and then to stay with it in the culture that I think now was represented by all the people up and down the hallway that we lived in, and stay with it long enough that eventually we ended up finding the surprise that meant that I guess I'm supposed to right now be writing a Nobel lecture today. But so that in the end, I think the story is so much coming out of this world that we came to find as grad students, and so personally, I'm just very grateful that world existed, and I'm hoping that we are able to pass on the next generation of it, the next versions of it. Even though it won't ever look the same without Louis in that chair by himself over here and everybody else in the audience over there, we're going to do our best to make things similar. So let me stop there and thank you.